In this lecture, we will look at the contextualist approach or framework to interpreting the Quran. This will be a very basic introduction to this framework. We will cover briefly the meaning of context and the four-step analysis of this approach. So, what is a contextual or contextualist approach? A contextualist approach to the Quran involves interpreting a range of Quranic verses or texts by taking into account the context in which the verse or verses were revealed, as well as the context of our time today. By context, I mean the social, political, economic, cultural, intellectual, and religious contexts of the time of the Quranic revelation, that is the early 7th century, as well as that of our time. While interpreting the Quran by taking into account these two contexts, we should also be aware of the contexts that the interpretation of these Quranic verses came through, that is, between the time of the revelation and our time today. A question often asked is this kind of interpretation of the Quran appropriate? To determine whether this kind of Quranic interpretation is appropriate, we firstly need to consider how grounded this kind of interpretation is in Islamic scholarship. We might ask this question: is this kind of interpretation of the Quran a legitimate exercise? There are a number of ideas and concepts that are relevant to any discussion about a contextual approach to interpreting the Quran. The idea of context has been very visible in Islamic scholarship, and central to this context is, of course, the life, personality, and activities of Prophet Muhammad. Muslim scholars have spent a lot of time trying to understand the life of the Prophet using what is called the sīrah literature, or sīrah is the biography of the Prophet, which includes many narratives describing the biography of the Prophet. Without the sīrah, it would be very difficult to make sense of certain texts of the Quran, the traditions of the Prophet, or even some Islamic ideas or practices. The Prophet's biography is also important for Muslims because they need to understand who the Prophet was, how he functioned, and the kinds of things he had to do. It is also important for understanding the context in which the religion of Islam began. Let us look at the occasions of the revelation, or asbāb al-nuzūl in Arabic. Specifically in the area of Quranic interpretation, there is a broad area of literature called asbāb al-nuzūl, or occasions of the revelation. This provides details of the circumstances surrounding the revelation of particular Quranic verses or texts. Not all Quranic verses have occasions or asbāb, but there are a number of Quranic verses where such narratives are available. In fact, when understanding these verses, scholars seem to rely rather heavily on the asbāb or occasions to obtain a better sense of these texts. This includes scholars of fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence as far as legal texts or verses are concerned. For these scholars, having a good sense of the particular circumstances that led to a particular revelation provides a better sense of the rationale behind the ruling the verse refers to, and how scholars arrived at related rulings in light of those circumstances. This is quite an important area of literature in Islamic scholarship. Now let us look at the Meccan and Medinan verses. In the literature on the principles of tafsir or Quranic interpretation, there is also a lot of discussion about whether particular verses of the Quran were revealed in Mecca or Medina. Again, the focus is on obtaining a better sense of the circumstances and context in which particular Quranic verses were revealed. Given the importance of that understanding, scholars try to classify Quranic verses and chapters based on whether they were revealed in Mecca or Medina. Again, the desire here is to gain a better sense of the context. Let us now look at abrogation, or in Arabic, Naskh. There is also quite a bit of discussion in Islamic legal literature about Naskh, or abrogation. In particular, this refers to the abrogation of a ruling by a later ruling, in particular in the Quran. Naskh also concerns context. Why is a particular Quranic verse or ruling found in a particular context considered to abrogate or nullify a previous verse or ruling? The issue here is that the context or circumstances of the first ruling changed, and therefore a new ruling was required. Again, there is a direct connection to the idea of context. Finally, we look at some of the interpretations of Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second successor to the Prophet. In Islamic law, there's also a fair bit of discussion about the rulings made by the second Caliph of Islam, Umar ibn al-Khattab. Umar's interpretation of certain Quranic verses clearly indicate that the context of the original verse or ruling had changed. Therefore, he needed to come up with some new understandings or new interpretations based on the new context. An example of this kind of interpretation occurs in relation to a zakat related verse, that is, chapter 9, verse 60. The verse is clear that zakat should only be given to the 8 categories of people mentioned in the verse. And one of those categories is what the Quran calls al-mu'allafat qulubuhum, meaning those whose hearts are to be reconciled. This basically means those people from whom the Muslims needed support in early Islam. This particular category of persons is mentioned in the verse. As a result, the Prophet Muhammad gave a share of zakat to them, as did the Prophet's successor, or the first successor, Abu Bakr. However, Omar, the second successor to the Prophet, understood the verse contextually. He felt that a share of zakat was given to these people at the time of the Prophet because in early Islam this support from them, these are tribal leaders, was needed. However, in his time, Islam had become stronger and there was no need for the Muslim state or the ruler to effectively buy the allegiance of these leaders. Omar reasoned that the context had changed, and when these leaders came to demand a share of the zakat, Omar said to them that Islam in the time of the Prophet was somewhat weak, and therefore the Prophet had provided them, or these leaders, with an incentive to side with the Muslims. But in Omar's time, things were different. The context had changed, and therefore he was not obliged to give a share of the zakat to them. The reason I have provided a survey of some of these context related ideas from Islamic scholarship is to suggest that a contextually appropriate interpretation of the Quran is not a foreign idea to Islamic thought. It is related to a number of ideas that exist in Islamic scholarship that are recognized by Muslim scholars and are seen as non-controversial. For some Muslims who are concerned about a contextualist approach to interpreting the Quran, this approach may appear rather modern and therefore not rooted in traditional Islamic scholarship. As a result, they may believe that this approach should be rejected. However, the points I have just mentioned indicate that the idea of context is well known to Islamic scholarship, Muslim scholars, Muslim jurists, and commentators on the Quran. It has been part of mainstream Muslim thinking about text and context for a long time. How should we understand the term context? Context can be understood at two different levels. First, at the level of micro context, and second, that of macro context. By micro context, I mean the linguistic context of a particular word, phrase, or even a sentence of the Qur'an. This word, phrase, or sentence in the Qur'an functions within a linguistic context, and we need to look at what is immediately before the text and what is immediately after it. This will give us a better sense of what the word, phrase, or sentence is referring to. Obtaining a good sense of the micro or linguistic context will often help us to achieve a better sense of what the text is trying to say. This is something that has been well understood in Islamic scholarship, so I will not spend much time unpacking this idea here. The second way that context can be understood is what I call the macro context. By this I mean the political, cultural, social, intellectual, economic, or religious circumstances or situations surrounding the time of the Quranic revelation. Here we are interested in the early 7th century of the Common Era in Mecca and Medina in particular, and the Hijaz region in general in Arabia. Having a good sense of this context will give us a better sense of how certain Quranic teachings or rulings functioned in their original context. It will help to understand the kinds of attitudes, values, norms, and practices that existed before and during the time of Quranic revelation, and how the Quran tried to modify them, reject them, or even in circumstances to affirm them. A Quranic text related to a particular issue, say, for example, gender relations, could be better understood if we obtain a good sense of the circumstances and the relevant ideas, values, and practices of the time. This approach will also help us to gain a better sense of how the very first Muslim community, that is, the companions of the Prophet, or that is the first generation of Muslims, reacted to particular Quranic texts and how they may have applied them in their daily lives. The aim of studying the macro context is not just about understanding the time of the Quranic revelation. It also relates to our own political, cultural, social, intellectual, economic, and religious contexts. Therefore, we often need to analyze the context or the values, norms, ideas, and practices that are relevant to a particular Quranic teaching or ruling as they apply to our time. Let us call the first macro context, in other words, the context of the time of the revelation, macro context 1. We can call the macro context of our time macro context 2. Of course, the Quranic text has also passed through a whole series of other contexts between the early 7th century and the early 21st centuries, which is our time. These are what we might refer to as connector contexts. Different scholars, interpreters, and jurists might have tried to understand particular Quranic verses or texts or teachings in light of their own contexts in the past. In this sense, the interpretation of a particular verse of the Quran should not be seen as disconnected from the immediate contexts in which the verse functioned and in which scholars and interpreters have also functioned in the past. We want to keep our attention on the close connection between the text of the Quran, the interpretation of the text, and the interpreters of the text as we move from the 7th century through history right up to the 21st century, which is our time. To illustrate my point in relation to the macro context, we could consider different aspects of this context in the early 7th century. Let us look at the macro context of Mecca and Medina, broadly speaking, as an example. Culturally, at this time, there were a number of religions in these two towns, which included Christianity, Judaism, and some form of paganism. It was a society where different religious traditions lived side by side. As a result, in this context, there were a variety of different beliefs about God, about life after death, about belief in one God or multiplicity of gods, and about scriptures and the like. There were a whole range of values and norms associated with these religious institutions and practices, religious traditions and practices. Thus, these towns were very mixed socially, culturally, and religiously as far as beliefs and values were concerned. Socially, there were also certain understandings about, for example, what a family was, how one was formed, and the kind of relationship a person should have in relation to his or her family and to larger entities such as the clan or tribe. There were also certain ideas in that context about the role of men and women in society, the status of men and women, about how violence should be used or otherwise, and the characteristics that were important for men or women or for leaders and so forth. In terms of the intellectual characteristics of the context, there were certain kinds of literature that were prominent or important, such as poetry. People in Mecca and Medina were proud of their language and their ability to eloquently express their thoughts, and these skills were very important for an accomplished person. Economically, the people of these towns depended on trade, and there were certain practices that were acceptable in terms of trade and commerce. There were also certain ideas that were accepted in the realm of borrowing and lending, and about the use of interest, for example. People also had particular understandings of money and the units of currency that were acceptable, as well as the role of gold and silver in exchange. Politically, this was a context where there was no state as such. Society depended on the tribal system and the decision making that was accepted within this tribal system. There are, of course, many other aspects of the context. In summary, this is a very brief overview of some of the elements of macro context 1. If we look at macro context 2 in relation to these elements in our societies today, we will find that some of these areas of concern may be quite different. Some of these may be so different, in fact, that macro contexts 1 and 2 may seem to be belonging to two very different worlds. If the macro contexts 1 and 2 are so different, we may have to give some serious thought to how we should interpret a relevant text of the Qur'an. On the other hand, there may also be some elements that are very similar. In this situation, there is little need to come up with an interpretation that is very different to the interpretation that was reached in the early 7th century in Mecca or Medina. So here are some questions that we may need to perhaps consider in thinking about the context. What is the meaning of context? What is the difference between micro context and macro context? How should we understand macro context 1? Where do we find information about macro context 1? What does connector context mean? And where do we find information about connector contexts? What kind of sources we should be looking at? How do we know about macro context 2? And where do we find information about this macro context 2? So, how do we interpret a text contextually? Let us look at the 4-step analysis very briefly. Let me provide a very brief overview of how a person might go about interpreting a Quranic text contextually. There are many ways this can be done. In fact, many Muslim scholars of the Quran today have put forward ideas about how to undertake this kind of interpretation. In my own writings, I have benefited from various scholars and their works. From this, I have tried to construct a model or a framework for interpreting the Quran contextually, which I will summarize for you. For me, it is helpful to look at the task of interpretation in terms of four basic steps. Obviously, interpretation of any text is a very complex matter, and there are many approaches to that. There are many different ways of doing that. But here I'm providing a rather simple framework or approach to interpretation of the Quran, particularly in relation to what we might call ethical and legal texts. Let us look at the step one of this framework, which is understanding the complex nature of some relevant issues or key issues. The first step in this framework is to recognize that the reader or interpreter of the text will approach the text in a particular way and brings to it that reader or interpreter's own life experiences, education, values, norms, and beliefs, presuppositions and assumptions about the world and the environment, the likes and dislikes, and values based on their family values and experiences, their school and university teachers, and a whole range of dominant norms and values from their society. However, many of these influences are not really accessible at a conscious level. They are part and parcel of a person's makeup and function on a subconscious level. So, part of this recognition involves acknowledging that the reader or interpreter cannot escape from these influences. Another aspect of this step involves developing a sense of the kind of text the reader will be interpreting. As a Muslim, the interpreter is likely to approach the Quran as the very word of God that was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. This text, therefore, is very important in his or her belief system. It is a sacred text. Another aspect is to acknowledge that language is not simple, it is extremely complex, and that the complexity of language and meaning is something that the reader should be aware of. The danger of not being aware of this complexity is that the reader may consider the text's language and meaning too simplistically. The reader may make the claim that there is only one meaning of this word or that phrase or sentence. There is no other possible meaning. So, having a very good understanding of what language is and how language functions, and what meaning is and how meaning functions, will help in the process of interpretation. Here are some questions we may need to consider in relation to step one. As the interpreter of the Quranic text, can I be 100% objective? What does it mean? Can I escape from my own feelings, likes, dislikes, my background, my education and training, and my life experiences in relation to the issue that the Quranic verse I'm interpreting is dealing with? Is the meaning of a word, phrase, or a sentence a simple thing or a very complex matter? Is language a very simple thing or a very complex thing? If meaning is a very complex issue, is it possible for me to say that there is only one meaning of this text and no other meaning is possible? Step two is about determining the reliability of the text we are interpreting. So the second step is in this approach or framework is to consider whether the text that is being interpreted is historically reliable. Well, when it comes to the Quran, Muslims believe that the Quran is historically reliable. Therefore, there is no need to ask this question about the Quranic text. But given that hadith or traditions of the Prophet are used in a significant way in Quranic interpretation, we need to consider the reliability of the hadith that are used in the process of interpretation. Here are some questions that would help in relation to this step. Is the text I am interpreting a historically reliable one? If a text such as hadith is unreliable, can we use such a hadith in interpretation? Step 3 is very important, and it is about linguistic and other analysis of the text, and also about macro context 1. This step, which is step 3, is perhaps the most complex and difficult because there are a whole range of sub-steps within it. Linguistic analysis is the starting point, and it involves a range of tasks. We can look at the syntax of the text or the grammar of the text, that is, how the words in the text are combined to form a sentence. And we can also refer to this as the basic grammar of the text. We look at individual words and phrases and the kinds of words that were used and why they were used. We look at the semantics of the text, that is, the meanings of individual words. We can also look at pragmatics as well, which are really about constraints faced and choices made by the text's author, including how certain words were used at the time and the stylistic features of the text. So this is all about linguistic analysis, different kinds of linguistic analysis, from grammar to the basic meanings to how words are used or were used. As part of this step, we also need to look at whether the text we are interpreting is within a thematic unit within the Quran. For example, the text or the verse might be in a place in the Quran that discusses, for example, gender issues. We need to look to take into account those verses that address this particular theme in the Quran. Having a good understanding of the thematic unit will also help us to understand the particular text better. We also need to look at whether there are parallel or similar texts on this issue elsewhere in the Quran, or relevant texts in the traditions of the Prophet, that is, hadith. Given that there may be many such texts, it may be quite difficult to put all the texts on the issue together. However, the interpreter is expected to make an effort to bring together relevant or parallel texts on the issue to the extent possible. This will help gain a good understanding of what these different texts are pointing to. If we ignore those parallel texts in the Quran and also in the Hadith, there is a danger that we might come up with an interpretation that ignores the many other texts in the Quran on the issue. Sometimes these texts may confirm what we believe the text is saying, or may shed light on some other related issue. In some cases, these texts may emphasize the same point the text that is being interpreted is making. Another aspect of the analysis at this step is in step 3 is to determine what type of text we are dealing with. Is it an ethical or legal text? That is it a text that raises an issue of ethics or law? Is it a commandment or prohibition? Or is it an instruction or a piece of advice? If not, is it a theological text or a historical text or another similar text? Given that the contextual approach to interpretation is best suited for interpreting ethical and legal texts, then it is probably not helpful to use this particular approach for interpreting theological or historical texts. Of course, some theological and historical texts could also be interpreted using a context-based approach. However, for our purposes, the most relevant type of text in the Quran to benefit from a contextualist reading would be ethical and legal texts. These texts are often very relevant to or dependent on their context. The next part of this step, which is step 3, is to look for historical sources that may shed light on the way things were done in early Islamic or pre-Islamic times in relation to the issue that we are looking at in the verse. These sources may reveal the kinds of values, norms, practices, or customs that existed in relation to the issue at hand. Here we are exploring macro context 1 of the text. That is the political, cultural, social, economic, intellectual, and religious context of the time in general and in relation to the particular Quranic text we are interpreting. For example, if we are interpreting a text that deals with, for example, gender relations, we will look at what the context was like in relation to gender related issues or the relationship between men and women at the time. Based on historical sources, then we will attempt to reconstruct macro context 1 to the extent possible. Having done the analysis of macro context 1 or the analysis associated with macro context 1 and determined the text's linguistic meaning and completed other analysis I have referred to here, we will look at a number of other things. First, we can try to gain a sense of how the first generation of Muslims, that is, the companions of the Prophet, may have understood the particular Quranic verse that we are dealing with. This information again could come from historical sources, Quranic commentaries, and the like. Once we have gained an understanding of what the companions of the Prophet or those earlier generations of Muslims said, we can develop a broader picture of how interpretations of the text moved from the first generation to subsequent generations. Whether or not scholars understood the text that we are dealing with differently during different periods of time or in different contexts is something that is very interesting for our analysis. One way to obtain this information is by going through the literature on Quranic interpretation, that is tafsir, as well as attempts by Muslim scholars to interpret these texts in the area of law, for example, in the area of Islamic jurisprudence. So, as far as possible, we can summarize the different understandings or different emphases that may have occurred or happened during different periods and in different contexts through interpretation over the last 14 to 1500 years. Here are some questions that might be helpful in relation to this step, which is step 3. What is the linguistic meaning of the text? What is the meaning of each word or phrase in the text? What should I check to understand the linguistic meaning of words in the text? Should it be just the dictionaries? What kind of dictionaries? Should I check each word in the text? What does the grammar or syntax of the text say about the meaning of the text? How are the words used in this text understood in different periods in the past? Is there any evolution or changes in the meaning of the words or some words used in the text? What do the stylistic features of the text tell us about the meaning of the text? What is before and after this text? Is this text within a number of verses dealing with a particular issue or amongst certain verses dealing with a particular issue? If so, how is this text related to the other verses in the immediate environment? Are there other verses or texts that deal with the issue that this text is dealing with in the Qur'an or in the traditions of the Prophet? What are they? If we put together the relevant texts around this issue, what is the picture that is emerging from all these put together in relation to the specific issue the verse is dealing with? What kind of text is this? Is it a theological text or a historical text or an ethical or legal text? Is the text appropriate for a contextualist interpretation? In relation to the specific issue the verse is dealing with, what was the macro context one like? What is the kind of information that we can get from historical sources, Quranic commentaries, hadith, biography of the Prophet, other sources of literature from the period around this issue in order to understand the kinds of ideas, beliefs, values, norms, practices that may have existed at the time in relation to this issue. How was this text understood by scholars in different periods in Islamic history, based on the information that is available in Quranic commentaries, relevant historical sources, juristic literature, and the like? Do you notice any differences among scholars in understanding this text? What are these differences like? Finally, were scholars in different periods or in different regions or contexts had different understandings of the text? If so, what were these differences like? Let us now look at the step 4, understanding macro context 2, and also finalizing the interpretation. In step 4, we are interested in understanding macro context 2, that is, the political, economic, social, cultural, and intellectual context of our time in relation to the particular issue we are addressing. For example, if we are dealing with an issue that concerns, again, gender relations, we will want to understand the kinds of values, beliefs, norms, customs, and practices that characterize our time and our society right now. Again, this must be based on various sources, including our own understanding of the world and the scholarship on these issues. An analysis of macro context 2 will lead to a comparison of macro contexts 1 and 2 to identify their similarities and differences. This may be a rather difficult task and involve comparison of the two contexts with a particular focus on specific areas. Having completed that analysis and taken into account the connector contexts, we are now ready to come up with an interpretation or a series of interpretations that might be relevant to the context of the text. If there are very huge or significant differences between macro context 1 and macro context 2, we may need to come up with an interpretation that takes into account the differences. This may perhaps suggest that the interpretation accepted in the very first period of Islam might need to be modified to some extent because of the changes in context. We still have not come up with a final interpretation at this stage, but we have a series of relevant interpretations that we can work with. The next sub step within this step 4 would be to reflect on those possible interpretations and work out what the most reasonable interpretation could be. We are looking at all these different possible interpretations now. While doing so, we must keep in mind that there are some very important and fundamental values and beliefs in the Quran. The interpretation that we come up with should not conflict with those very fundamental Quranic beliefs, values, and practices. For example, the interpretation should not conflict with the idea that there are 5 pillars of Islam or there are 6 pillars of faith. An interpretation that tries to question the obligatory nature of the 5 daily prayers, for example, will not be acceptable to a Muslim because the 5 daily prayers are one of the pillars of Islam. An interpretation that tries to argue that there is no need to pay zakat today should be rejected because this is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. An interpretation that tries to argue that there is no life after death should be rejected because belief in life after death is one of the 6 pillars of faith. The point here is that the interpretation we come up with should not conflict with the most important fundamentals of Islam. One criterion for the interpretation's reasonableness is whether it is in line with the dominant values and concerns of Muslims today. There are particular things that are very important for Muslims today. For example, the right to equality of all people in a modern state. An interpretation that results in an emphasis on inequality or discrimination should be rejected because it is contrary to the context in which Muslims live today. The reasonableness of interpretation should also be checked to see if it conforms to the sensibilities of the interpretive community that the reader or interpreter belongs to. That is, the Muslim community in a particular place or context today. If an interpreter comes up with an interpretation that goes against the core sensibilities of his or her interpretive community, that is the Muslim community in which the interpreter functions, then it is very unlikely that the interpretation will be accepted. Finally, the interpretation should not go against the basic linguistic meaning of the text. For instance, an interpretation that argues that paying zakat means visiting a certain place should not be accepted because it goes against the basic linguistic meaning of the text. Paying something does not mean that it's about visiting a certain place. Another important point is that the interpretation should not go against the Qur'an's clearly spelled out commandments and prohibitions. For example, the Qur'an says riba, R-I-B-A, is prohibited. The riba is often understood by Muslims as interest on loans. So the interpretation should not suggest that riba is permitted, because the Quran says riba is prohibited, and therefore riba is prohibited, and an interpretation should not suggest that riba should be permitted today. The Quran is very clear on the prohibition of riba. However, the interpretation could ask, what exactly is riba? The basic idea is that if something is clearly prohibited, that should not be questioned. I mean, very, very clearly spelled out as a prohibition. That prohibition should not be questioned. But one can always ask questions about what exactly is that thing that is prohibited. In this case, riba, for example. What is riba? How is riba understood, and how should it be understood? That's the question. Once an interpreter goes through all these different analyses and checks, they arrive at an interpretation that may appear to be reasonable, authoritative, and has a chance of being accepted by the interpretive community to which the interpreter belongs. Here are some questions that might be helpful in dealing with step 4. In relation to the specific issue the verse is dealing with, what is macro context 2 like? What kind of information that we can get and put together around this issue from various sources? What are the main similarities and differences between macro context 1 and macro context 2 as far as this issue is concerned? Are the differences greater than the similarities, or are the similarities greater than the differences? In relation to the issue of focus in the text, what are the most dominant and widely accepted views among Muslims today, globally or locally? Are these views in line with the interpretation of the text in the earlier generations? Based on the analysis in step 3 and the analysis in step 4, what are the possible interpretations that one could arrive at as far as this text is concerned? Of these interpretations, what are the most important one or two interpretations? For what appears to be the most important and relevant interpretations of the text, is the interpretation in line with the basic linguistic meaning of the text? Does the interpretation conflict with the most important and fundamental values, beliefs, and practices of Islam that Muslims universally see as important and fundamental? Is the interpretation in line with what appear to be universal values in the Quran, such as justice, fairness, and equity? Is the interpretation in line with what Muslims in general consider to be important and relevant values today? Finally, is the interpretation likely to be accepted by the interpretive community to which the interpreter belongs? Let us now look at some of the criticisms of this approach and some responses very briefly. We don't have time to go into this in detail. There are all kinds of reservations on the part of many Muslims about this kind of approach to interpreting the Quran. They argue that if we follow this kind of interpretation or this approach to interpretation, we may end up with a situation where the basics of the religion are completely distorted and people can come up with all kinds of interpretations that simply follow their whims. I would argue that the contextualist approach to interpreting the Quran, as I have outlined here, has quite a lot of safeguards against these kinds of relativistic interpretations. And these safeguards should protect the text from such personal interpretations that have no basis in scholarship. So, in summary, I have outlined here very briefly what I call a contextualist approach to interpreting the Quran and how one may go about doing that. And obviously, this is a very, very brief introduction.
Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more lectures in this series as we explore the Qur'an's history, themes, and interpretation, as well as related debates today. Subscribe and turn on notifications to catch the next lecture in the series.